Good evening, everyone. We'll just wait for everyone to join us. Just a couple of moments. Everyone's still flooding in, which is good. So I think most people are here, so we'll get started. So welcome and a big thank you for joining us on today's webinar, which is on integrating neurocognitive rehab into return to sport protocols with Angela Jackson. Today's webinar is brought to you by Steriplast in partnership with BASREP. So before we start, as always, we'll run through some housekeeping rules. Firstly, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. It's great for everyone to be able to see all the different professions that have joined us today and where everyone is based in the world. Today's webinar will last around 40 minutes and then we'll have time for any question anyone has for Angela. Please pop any questions you have in the Q&A box throughout the presentation and we'll try to get to them all. If you see any questions that other people have asked and you'd also like answered, you can upvote these by pressing the thumbs up, which lets us know the most popular questions and which ones to get to first if we do have a big influx. And then finally, everyone does get a certificate for today's webinar and the recording of this evening's presentation. We do aim to get these out within 2 weeks. So we'll go through a little bit about BASREP. For those of you that are new to these webinars and don't know much about it, we'll just give a brief overview. So apologies to those who join these webinars regularly and already know about BASREP. So who are BASREP? BASREP are the professional associator and regulator for sports rehabilitators and trainers. We provide regular CP webinars for our associate members and registrants. So if you're in a healthcare profession and you're interested in being an associate member, please feel free to get in touch. It is £5 a month and the benefits are listed on screen. Thank you all again for joining today. I hope everyone enjoys the webinar and a big thank you to Angela for giving up her time this evening. I'll just hand over to Andrew now to do a Steriplast introduction.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks very much, Angela, for kindly giving up the time. I think there's a lot of interest in the topic tonight, so it should be a great presentation. As Sophie said, apologies to those who've heard our introductions before. I'll just quickly go through who we are, where we're from. I work for Steriplast Healthcare, and our sport division is Sterasport. So leading our work with different teams and organisations involved in sport, from grassroots to professional or elite sport. And basically our products are medical products for sports injuries, so consumables and medical equipment. Really pleased to work with lots of organisations in the Northwest where we're based, but around the country as well. You can see our website there, so please do get in touch if there's anything we can help with. And if you could just move that on, please, Sophie. So the Injury Rehab Network is now in its 5th year, I think, and it started as a local group for practitioners and professionals that were in the Northwest where we're based, as a forum for people to collaborate, share good practice, hear from experts around different topics. We've been working with BASREP since the start, and during lockdown, we were really pleased to be able to sort of bring these events online, and extremely grateful to all the guest speakers who kindly give up the time. And we've covered a whole range of different topics, but continue to get some really good attendances. And as you can see there, there's a lot of different topics that are being covered this year. And our next event is again sort of another topic that we haven't heard from before. So Siobhan O'Donovan is a physiotherapist working with women around, making sure that they're well supported. So please do get involved in that one. But yeah, I hope you enjoy the presentation from Angela this evening. And thanks again, Angie, for giving up your time. Angie's on a mission to educate around young people's well-being and rehabilitation. So yeah, hopefully it's useful, and you can always follow up and get in touch with Angie if you find the session useful today.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Andrew. Would you like me to kick off, Sophie? Are you ready for me?
Yeah, perfect. Ready when you are.
Okay, I'll share my screen now. All righty, Sophie, is that all okay?
Can't see it. 1 second. I'm just going to stop sharing mine and see if that works.
I just wondered that. Do you want me to stop sharing and do it again?
1 second.
You stop and then I'll give it again.
Yeah. There we go. Is that working? Has that stopped?
How's that?
Yeah, we can see that. That's great.
Good. Okie dokie. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. The title was pretty comprehensive in terms of lots of long words, and there's an awful lot of long words associated with the research around neurocognitive rehab. And I want to basically spend some time tonight just simplifying that. So a lot of the work I use is around the train the brain, not the sprain. And I want to just get us to really start to think about, is our rehab good enough after ligament injuries? And so when we start to look at that data, 22% of people who've had an ACLR reconstruction had a second ACL injury, and 77% of those were female. 40% after a lateral ankle sprain failed to cope and developed chronic ankle instability. And in the most recent study by Webster, 40% of those who had had a primary ACL injury went on to sustain a second one in male athletes. So it's not just a female domain, this, and it's not just across specific sports. It seems to be that we can give them a year of rehab, but basically we don't seem to be reducing the rates of these injuries. And these people are going on to sustain long-standing residual deficits. And across the research there, we've got people who've been through good rehab. They've passed their hot test. They've passed all sorts of different return to play criteria. And yet 2 years later, they're still showing as having a quadriceps strength deficit. Interestingly, when they, in a different study, looked at postural stability, when these athletes post-ACLR were given dual task and both a visual and a cognitive task, it affected their ability to maintain postural stability. And we obviously are familiar with all the aberrant movement patterns, higher ground reaction forces that seem to still exist despite really extensive rehab. So I guess I'd question, do our traditional approaches to rehab actually work? What do we think is, a success? I don't think it's good enough to see all of those sort of recurrence rates. So for me, I think we've got to look at really, really hard, what's our return to play criteria and what's our rehab doing? Because maybe it's not actually protecting these guys from a second injury. If we start to look at maybe the mechanism of injury, does that help us? And certainly video analysis, performance analysis has really helped us to start to observe those microseconds prior to somebody getting a non-contact injury. It's much more difficult to obviously give feedback on a contact injury, but certainly these non-contact injuries, is there any way we can look at the video analysis to begin to understand whether there's anything we can do in terms of prevention? We know that they occur during deceleration, changes of direction, rapid cutting and pivoting, and that's really not anything that's significant or new in the research. But what's beginning to become interesting is that maybe they're occurring during some form of perturbation. And that perturbation may not necessarily be a contact perturbation. It could actually be some form of distraction. And certainly during more cognitive demanding tasks, certainly in, say, the soccer player in defense, maybe what we're beginning to see is that they exceed the reserves of the brain. Maybe they're so busy trying to process all the information of the different plays, where they're going to pass the ball to next, that what we're seeing is a dropout in their movement competency. And so perhaps the mechanism of non-contact injuries is perhaps less about the biomechanics and more a cognitive motor interaction. And this was the study that was done in a very recent study, 2024, in the Journal of Athletic Training. And these names that you're seeing here, you'll start to see are very prevalent across a lot of the literature. But what they showed was that perhaps there are neurocognitive errors associated with non-contact injuries. This group of players were male professional soccer players. And in defenders, what they were saying is under high neurocognitive load, there appears to be a lack of temporospatial awareness. Perhaps their attention is being divided between the player that's coming at them at speed, what they're going to do with the ball if they do get it, an awareness of other players around them, and so many other environmental things. Certainly, if you're close to the touchline of a soccer environment, you can often hear lots and lots of voices going on, directed at what the player should and shouldn't do next. And all of this may impact our motor control. So then maybe we've got to start to look and think, well, what might reduce their ability to process all this information simultaneously? And certainly when you start to look at the concussion populations, we know that post-concussion, there's quite a lot of processing issues, reaction times go down, and that's one of the ways in which we work out whether players are ready to go back post-concussion, is that we start to look at all of these different multitasking processing abilities. So we know that there's a link between concussion and lower limb injuries, and perhaps the link is less around the mechanics that are going on in the lower limb and actually to do with the brain injury. We need to also think then about the population I work with. A lot of them are relatively new to the sport. So when you first learned to drive, think about how much actual attention you had to pay to even just coordinating what we in the UK, I saw many different countries represented in the audience tonight, but in the UK, we call it the clutch. We have a manual, most of us are taught to drive in a manual car, and we have to coordinate the accelerator, the brake, and the clutch. And it's hard. You can all remember how there's no way at that point you could change the channel on the radio. You could cope with chatting away to a passenger, perhaps sorting out the GBS. It all required an inordinate amount of attention just to focus on how to do the skill. So when somebody's learning something new in that therapeutic environment, a lot of their attention is going to be on actually how to move and not all the other environmental things going on. And so there are very chaotic scenes. If you take a child's playground through to an elite sports performance, there's lots of noises, there's lots of colors, there's the wind to contend with. There's so many other factors that might divert this player's attention. We mentioned post-concussion, but the interesting one that's coming through in a lot of the literature to do with young athletes is just how prevalent neurodiversity is in the youth athlete population. It takes an immense amount of focus and dedication, which are real positives in some of the neurodiverse children, in order to be able to continue to practice, to dedicate hours and hours of time and hyper focus. And so what we're seeing is a lot of children appear to have many neurodiversity traits. We know that when you're anxious, that reduces your capacity to process information. And so consequently, suddenly we need to start thinking about how many of these demands are likely to impact our rehabilitation process. Now, just because you've got somebody perhaps with hyper attention deficit, or they perhaps have any of the autistic traits, doesn't mean that they are going to have a drop in performance. You can have brilliant performances, whether you have neurodiversity or not. Anxiety may actually be the thing that is a real tipping point between fantastic performances and not. So we're not saying that everybody with this subset of traits is going to be more susceptible to ACL, but we do need to consider whether we know whether any of these are prevalent in our subjective history. And where's the research with this? Well, this paper by Adam Rosen looking at chronic ankle instability has split those into copers and non-copers. So not really considering the level and degree of structural damage, but those who go on not to re-injure and not to get chronic ankle instability were his copers versus the non-copers. And what he started to look at was in the non-copers, they appeared to have slower reaction time, slower processing speed, visual memory deficits, and lower simple attention span. Well, that again could be somebody post-concussion. It could be somebody with dyslexia. So we need to start thinking about each and every athlete as an individual and what might their processing capacity be. We can take that on a step further, where in the United States, many, many more high school athletes have had impact tests, which for those that are not familiar with them, are used in order to assess somebody's cognitive ability and reaction times and things prior to the season, so that if they sustain a concussion, the objective is to get them back to pre-baseline levels before a return to play. But what's been really helpful here is when this group were then looking at which of those athletes that they'd got impact scores for went on to sustain an ACL injury, matched against a group of non-ACL participants, they also noticed that reaction time, processing speed, and in this instance, verbal memory tests were correlated with those that had an ACL and those had lower baseline scores. In baseball, what they've shown now is that in ADHD, maybe these people have a reduced ability to regulate sensory information efficiently. Perhaps they do get overloaded more readily than perhaps some other children, and faced with maybe lots of information, lots of complex plays within a game, perhaps at this point it affects their attentional capacity and maybe impact their motor control. So I now want you to think about your return to play and your rehabilitation processes. Think about the last sprained ankle you saw. Think about the last ACL that you rehabbed. And what I want you to consider for a moment is these are kind of the sorts of tests that traditionally have been around in the research with regard to return to play. So our single hop for distance, triple hop for distance, our crossover, and maybe some form of 6-meter timed hop. Perhaps we've used Y tests, perhaps we've used tuck jumps, agility tests, T tests. But importantly, what I want you to think about, do any of those actually test these cognitive demands of sport? Think about that footballer who's in defense, the amount of demands on him. Do any of these tests actually test physical as well as cognitive skills at the same time? And when I'm teaching, I always think about rehabilitation as starting with the end in mind. If we really don't take time to understand what these athletes are going back to, then how on earth are we going to know what we've got to get them up to? So let's start to think about the kinds of things that might go through your mind as you're starting to plan this rehabilitation program. No doubt you'll think of all the physical things: strength, power, proprioception. As we progress, we might start to look at acceleration and deceleration, changes of directions, cutting, speed, agility. But my question would be, how often do you think about creating unplanned, unanticipated movements that really are going to stand up to the different demands of all the sporting environments that they play in? And do you ask about neurodiversity within your subjective? I'll often ask about whether they crawled, were they late to hit any of their milestones? Did they have any problems riding a bike? Do they have any problems with reading or writing at school? Just to build a picture. I don't come right out and say, you know, are you on the autism spectrum? Have you got attention deficit? But I'll ask questions around it within my pre-assessment questionnaire. But importantly, what I'm looking for here is, do I understand the demands of their sport from a cognitive level? How much do they have to process complex visuospatial information? How much do they have to rely on their working memory, reaction times? How much do they have to split their attention and be able to multitask? And this is all so important, because we want to know that, yes, can they hop for distance, but can they, in the middle of that hop, suddenly make a decision about where to land, where to throw the ball next, and what's going on around them. And there's some brilliant papers come out by Taberner et al. One around football, I believe a recent one more around basketball. And it's called the control to chaos continuum. And for me, that's exactly what we need to do in rehabilitation. When we're in a sort of 10-foot by 12-foot room, we can't cause chaos. It's really hard to replicate the demands for an ACL patient, a lateral ligament patient, and in fact, even anything in my world down to things like our Osgoods and our Severs. If we want to truly get people prepared back for a return to sport, we need to make sure that we address all of the chaos so that they are ready to respond to all of these different external stimuli and be able to multitask at the same time. Now, what's interesting is that there's been some recent studies, particularly out in the States around Ohio University. And the name Dustin Grooms comes up a lot, and the team that are working around the world with him on these different projects. And what they've done, and admittedly, they're very small studies, very small numbers of cohorts, but really exciting work in terms of maybe shedding some light on why perhaps some of these athletes go on to get a second ACL injury after reconstruction. And I'm not going to get deep into this at this point because it would take too long within this sort of snapshot of what we're looking at. But what it shows here is that the areas that are highlighted in red were the ACLR group. And what this shows us is that there are changes in sensory motor cortex activity and different areas of the brain post ACLR. So in comparison to the blue areas, which are the control, you can see that there are slightly different representations in the brain in the ACLR group. And one of the important parts across their different research is that they've observed this increased visual motor processing with a change in sensory motor processing. And so I guess we need to look at how much attention you place on reducing overdependence on that visual system. It starts very early within the rehabilitation process. Most of us leave things like doing visual training, doing closing the eyes until much later. But closing the eyes doesn't really replicate the demands of many sports that I'm aware of. If I was diving off a high board and I was Tom Daley, I might well shut my eyes, but that would be out of fear. It wouldn't be a part of the normal sporting process. So I think we need to look at other methodologies to address this sensory reweighting that goes on in the brain after injury. So what tends to happen is we know that after ligamentous injury, we get damage to the mechanoreceptors, and that's going to cause a loop up to the brain. And sort of basically what the brain will do is say, well, if I can't depend on proprioception at the moment and I'm getting faulty input from my mechanoreceptors and the ligaments, then what I'll do is I'll upscale vision. I could upscale vestibular, I could upscale cerebellum, but most commonly I'll upscale and amplify vision to help out while I'm trying to reestablish proprioceptive control. Now, under a controlled environment, think about when we first do our single leg control work. Maybe we're doing like a star excursion test. Maybe we're doing a Y test, just doing some simple balance work. What you'll see is that when we're still, vision is responsible for around 33% of vision, vestibular around 17%, and then our proprioception around 50%. But when we get into a dynamic environment where we're having to change direction and do all sorts of things within the sporting environment, look at that shift. Vision gets down powered to around 3%, and our vestibular system gets upscaled to around 82%. So the thing that we maybe need to think about in rehabilitation is how do we actually do some vestibular rehab, much in the same way as perhaps we might do with our concussion patients or our ENT patients. We need to start looking at all of those skill sets that the vestibular rehabilitation therapists have got, and perhaps start to integrate some of those into our ligamentous rehab. So I want you to keep questioning all the time as we're chatting is, are you really only addressing the physical, or are you actually addressing these neurocognitive changes that we now know exist within the brain? Are you looking at those population groups and starting to assess risk and seeing how our rehab strategies can promote adaptive sensory motor brain activity? So I think that's enough really in terms of the theory. Let's start to look at how this might occur. So I'm just going to play you a little video. Let me just see if we can find that. Okay, let's just see if we can get this to play. So what we've got here is Sam just doing some simple hop drills and really just looking to see whether he's got much trunk lean. Are there any associated compensations? And just how does he sort of cope with sort of using that hopping forwards and backwards and seeing how much he's using his eyes. And what you'll notice is that predominantly his eyes are down. Now, what happens now is I've put some glasses on him, and these are the stroboscopic glasses, and you can see that there's a lot more lateral movement. And certainly on his left leg, what we were able to observe was that the movement became much more jerky. He found it really hard. He said that the effort level was a lot greater, and he had a lot greater trunk lean on this left side. He was struggling to maintain that center of gravity when I basically reduced some of the visual input that he was able to get. And I use these stroboscopic glasses. I use the synaptic ones a lot. And what they do is, in many ways, they create an external focus, which we're going to go on to discuss. They create a level of perturbation. They flash on and off. So what they're actually doing is filtering the amount of light that you get. They don't block the light like closing your eyes would. They can filter, and you can change the speed, you can change the fields. And these were used by Nike way back when, by Nike way back when, and my kids used them in their teens about a decade ago, primarily for performance. But what's really important now is we're beginning to see how important these could be for changing that visual dependency and promoting perhaps proprioception to have to be upskilled again. So what we need to start to think about is, how do we actually free up the brain to move without thinking? We need to be able to think whether we can reproduce movement under pressure, create lots of movement variability. Those days of knees over second toes have gone, purely and simply because if I watch my son play field hockey, the chances of him ever lunging with his knee directly over his second toe are very, very limited. And we realized that teaching somebody to move under control in the rehab room didn't prepare them for a return to play. But importantly, we've also got to prepare for the unpredictable. How often does somebody move into the line where they were going to land, where they were going to move, kick, or throw? But also we need to consider how well they retain the information that we teach them within the therapeutic environment. Because the last thing we want is for this young athlete to be back on a soccer field going, now, before I kick and before I change direction and decelerate, how did Angie say I've got to put my knee here, I've got to put my foot here, I've got to land soft? So we need to get them to a point where they can move without thinking. And one of the things that we perhaps need to start exploring as clinicians is, how does all of the theory of learning, the theory of coaching, how do they get young people to learn skills that stick? Because they don't coach movement in the same way as we often coach therapeutic exercises. And one of the things that is worth looking at are the papers by Wolf et al. They're quite old papers, but they were called the optimal theory of learning. And many of these aspects of optimal learning have really come through as being methodology that might be really, really helpful for retraining our neurocognitive stuff. And what it all stands for, that acronym, is optimizing performance through intrinsic motivation and attention for learning. I did warn you that there's lots of complicated words, but we're going to simplify that, because really what it does is it breaks it down into 3 pillars, 2 of them motivational and 1 of them attentional. The motivational ones are called enhanced expectancies and providing autonomy of support. And I would really recommend reading these papers, specifically the ones around youth athlete development, because they really describe in detail how we go about this. And the final one is more, where do we put our focus of attention? So within that optimal theory of learning, our enhanced experiences is really about building confidence. You could say to a child, the last child that I had at this stage of their ankle rehab wasn't doing nearly as well as you are. Now, you have to be careful that you don't build false confidence and they go running out and playing soccer again. But actually, we need to boost them to help them believe that they're going to be able to, in the future, get back to doing what they love. How often do you think about the goals that you set them? Within a rehab session, do you actually make sure that you get points where you can manipulate the task to make it successful, not so easy that they don't then respect themselves for what they've done, but not so hard that it causes you to feel like you did when you were learning to drive, rigid, jerky, sweating, anxious. So our job is to set tasks that are at the appropriate level of difficulty for the age and stage of the athlete and the stage of the rehabilitation process. But critically here, we also have to start to observe which of our athletes hate mistakes, because those kids that are perfectionists tend to have a much greater risk of injury. Those kids that are constantly beating themselves up, their self-talk's really bad, nothing's ever going to be good enough, then that can also impact this optimal theory of learning. The other part of it is the autonomy support, give them choices. So I want you to just think for a moment about the last treatment session that you were in. What choices did you give the athlete? Did you let them choose how many exercises they were going to take home with them? Did you ask them what format they wanted those exercises in? If I was going to do squatting and lunging, I'll ask the athlete which order they want to do them in. So we set the prescription, but which order, how many times a day, really makes no difference to us. But what we need to do is give them that feeling of choice. And one of the interesting studies that was done in golf was when they gave the person and the participant the choice of the color of golf ball, the skill set went up. The actual time that they retained the skill for over a couple of weeks stayed for longer. So our motivation is going to be greater if we feel like we've given a choice. If you remember when you were told to clean your bedroom as a teenager versus perhaps being asked, or perhaps the benefits were explained, then perhaps we get more buy-in. And perhaps certainly the talk I'm giving at Therapy Live this year is all about that motivation and how we do this more effectively. But I want you to also think about, do you give them a choice as to when they get their feedback? Do you associate feedback with positive feedback or negative feedback? Does it matter to the patient? Have they thought about whether they want to know when they're getting it right or when they're getting it wrong? Different kids might want different things, but importantly, we need to ask them. And in order to simplify the terminology around neurocognitive rehab, I've created this acronym called Roll the Dice. The D stands for differential learning, implicit learning, the C for contextual interference, and E for external focus of attention, which you may notice was in the optimal learning and perhaps is part of this overlap. And so I want to just briefly go through each of these. Impossible to cover them in detail in such a short time, but I have tons of videos of this within the Train the Brain course for those that are interested. So our differential learning, just think back before we get you to read that slide, is in a game of soccer, how often does a player maybe do 10 throw-ins followed by 10 kicks followed by 10 sprints? And yet in your rehab, quite often, we'll get people to do maybe 10 squats, 8 squats, 12 squats, the number's irrelevant. But we'll often do our squatting, then perhaps we'll do our lunging, and then perhaps maybe hopping. But have you ever thought about whether that prepares them for the sport that they do? So somebody who's in a very closed environment, perhaps like Tom Daley diving off a board, perhaps he needs high degree of repetition. But if we're going into a more complex environment, such as American football, basketball, netball, all of these sports where it's constantly changing, then perhaps we need to emphasize this differential learning. When we're first learning something, we need to make sure that they can actually do the movement skill in isolation. So the first thing we do is teach movement quality. But very quickly after that, I start mixing things up. So say, for example, in the stage of rehab we're at, we're utilizing squat, lunge, and hop. In the first phases, we're going to use what we call blocked differential learning. 3 sets maybe, or 4 sets, we change it quite quickly. But what we're going to do is a set of squats followed by a set of lunges, followed by a set of hops. Predictable. But what we have to do is move towards the unpredictable. So perhaps then we still stay in sequence, what we call serial differential learning, squat, lunge, hop, squat, lunge, hop. But then we start to need to introduce that random to create increase in reaction time. So we start to incorporate random sequencing, and perhaps we do that by maybe we've got a navy cone for squat, a green cone for lunge, and a blue cone for hop. And we hold them up and we request that the athlete does whatever movement is associated with whatever color. And I use like big printed, laminated playing cards. I use numbers, I use colors, I use all sorts of things to try and start to replicate some of the cognitive demands whilst creating this differential learning. Within our implicit learning, this goes back to what we were talking about before. Just do it. Don't think, just do it. Learning without conscious awareness. So explicit means that we are conscious of what we're doing. We're making a decision to actually do that at a specific time in a specific way. But implicit is being blissfully unaware that we're learning. And that frees up the brain to start to have some more capacity to cope with unpredictable motion. If any of you have learned to ski, then the ski instructor in whatever language doesn't stand there and say, now children, I want you to bend your hips to this degree. I want you to put your knees in this position. I want you to put your shins in this position. Skis here, hands here, head here. They don't do that. What they do is say pizza and chips usually, where they go from parallel to snowplow and parallel to snowplow. And so with minimal instruction, they create an image that the child is already familiar with. So we need to perhaps think about analogies. We need to think about metaphors for the various movements that we want to do. And what this does is create unintentional learning. And the ability to then retain that when they go back to sport is much greater than when we've used lots and lots of vocabulary to describe the movement we want. We can show them what we mean. We can show them a video if you're not competent at it. But equally, we can start to try and translate it into something that they already know. When we come to our contextual interference, focus on the second word, interference, and start to think about how you could physically interfere with the skill or cognitively interfere with the skill as you're beginning to teach it. So once again, we teach the motor skill to a level that's safe. Perhaps they're doing a single leg motion and we want them to work on balance. Very early in their rehab, we probably don't want to add too much perturbation, but there's nothing wrong with them doing a cognitive skill during that time. So it's important here that in the very early phases, we may get them to be doing a motor skill and perhaps say, for example, counting back from 103s if they're able to do that. And that would absolutely get them distracted from thinking about standing perhaps on that new ACLR reconstruction. So what we're really doing is shifting their attention away from being very internal focused to a secondary focus. And so there's lots of products now available on the market that can help create this. These are the aqua bags that I use a lot, where you're filling up either a like a Swiss ball type shape or like a foam roller, but they've got water. So when they start to bring these in, they add that element of unpredictability. They'll throw the athlete off balance. I use a lot of banded work, and here with using one of the activities we use with our cricketers, where we'll start to get him hopping and then get him to start to increase that tension. I could be holding the band, or he could be doing it himself attached to a squat rack. And so we're just trying to create something that might replicate the demands of the sport that they play. And this is really where dual tasking comes in. If any of you saw me at Therapy Expo last year, we were doing lots of demos of this on the main stage and having lots of fun with it. And really what we were doing was trying to look at not just dual tasking from a physical perspective, but also a cognitive one. So that as our players go back onto the field, they can process information. Remember, we said that it may be that our motor control gets dropped when we exceed the reserves of the brain. And so it's massively important that we address this within our rehabilitation process. So I use all sorts of different things. I use reaction lights. I've got fit lights. I've got the blaze pods and another set as well. I'll use balls for juggling. I'll use lots of different numbers, maths equations. The kids will be naming different animals with different alphabets. But critically here, what we're doing is distracting them from what they're doing. The movement that they create may not be perfect, but how often do we see perfect movement on a sports field? And I guess what you need to then think about is, let's say, for example, that we did our traditional hop test. Let's do a hop test. We don't need to throw out all of what we've done. What we need to do is add a neurocognitive challenge to what we already do. So let's say we were looking at perhaps a hop for distance or a triple hop for distance. What we need to do is measure that hop for distance in isolation. Get an objective measure. Let's say it was 1.10 meters. And then we can then add maybe some reaction lights, or we could add a cognitive challenge and make sure that they can do that in isolation. We need to make sure that people can do the cognitive or the additional physical challenge in isolation before we start to merge them. But let's say then we do that repetition of that hop. And perhaps we'd expect a drop in performance. That would be to be expected. But what they've started to look at is how much of a drop is relevant. And in this particular paper, what they said was a greater than 10% difference in the post-ACLR group between a pure physical and a neurocognitive hop test should be regarded as perhaps being something that needs to be addressed before they return to sport. And the one bit that we've not really talked about yet is our external focus of attention. It was part of the optimal theory of learning, and it forms part of my DICE acronym. And really what this is doing is taking that focus from being within. Think about how you perhaps teach a static quad. Do you tell them to brace their knee, tighten their kneecap? Those are internal focuses, making them think around their body part. Or do you say, squash my hand by putting your hand underneath their knee? Perhaps you could use a pressure biofeedback under their knee and get them to try and increase the pressure in the cuff. I've seen pediatric physios doing squeaky toys. Can the person squash the squeaky toy and make a noise? But what this is doing is creating this implicit learning where there's less conscious thought and more thought about the direction of the movement that we're trying to achieve. And there are some fantastic ways to do that. We've mentioned that the role of dual tasking, but also virtual reality is really beginning to come into the forefront. They've had some outstanding results using an external focus of virtual reality on children with severe pain at Sheffield Children's Hospital. You can use a motion guidance laser. We can use metaphors like jump like a kangaroo, but those only work if the child knows how to jump like a kangaroo. And this particular study was really, really helpful for me understanding not just how important creating an external focus is for optimal theory of learning, but also how it creates a different activation pattern within the brain. So these two quotes, if you're on your phone, say the one in green says, please focus on keeping the Bosu ball level. The other says, focus on keeping your feet level. Think about which one is an internal focus and think about which one is external. What you'll notice is the one that's talking about the feet creates an internal focus in red versus keep the Bosu ball level is an external focus. And what you see here is a different pattern of activation. Think about the words you use when you use a drop jump. Which of these is internal and which is external? So land soft and quiet, or bend your knees when you land. Bend your knees when you land is obviously internal versus land soft and quiet is external. But does any of it matter? Well, yes, it does, because using that same external cue, there was an improvement in physical landing mechanics. It reduced the ground reaction forces, and importantly, it increased perceptual awareness of how they landed. So the language we use can make or break a physical skill. So I'd ask you again, does our traditional return to play testing truly prepare the athlete for the chaos and the demands of a return to sport post ACL? This neurocognitive dual task challenging is required to highlight any neural compensations during our proprioceptive tasks. We don't need to throw everything out. We just need to add to it. And we can do all sorts of things. There's a brilliant app called Switched On, which I use, which has got some free programs. And that will enable you to set a program using the differential learning, using dual tasking, using reaction times to get them to respond to colors, numbers, and directions. You can make up a wall using like a twister mat instead of reaction lights. So telling them which colors. You can set them projects, get the kids to make up games around things that you've set them within the treatment program. They love it and they feel more engaged. And again, we can use our synaptic goggles. So I would highly recommend these papers by Matt Taberner, looking at that control to chaos continuum. It is just so important that we create unpredictable movements around chaos under multitasking environments before we send them back to sport and free up the brain to do what it should. So make sure our rehab is both sports and individual specific, taking account for any of those different risk factors that we said were specific to the concussion population and our neurodiversity, but also those new to sport. So our priorities: reduce the dependence on the eyes. Start to learn more about how to do vestibular rehab. You're not all going to have synaptic goggles, but you can all start moving the head left to right, doing different tracking things with the eyes. We can create that movement variability. Get out of the habit of just doing blocks of treatment. Create the ability to adapt and do it without thinking in that chaos and replicating those demands of the sport. So that's been an absolute whistle-stop tour of how to promote that adaptive sensory motor brain activity. But I hope we've simplified some of the concepts. I hope I've whet your appetite to go and read some of the other papers that are out there. There's tons of them. I'd recommend the work by Dustin Grooms and his team. and there's some other really good authors out there as well. If you've enjoyed my approach to teaching, I have a full course on this called Train the Brain, Not the Sprain. I can't pronounce it. And with the code SteroSport, you can get a 10% discount off the online course. But I'm also doing this course in person as part of the Injury to Return to Playing Junior Athletes. There's 2 dates left for 2024. We're over at R4P in Liverpool for those in the Northwest, and down at Portsmouth at Eastleigh in October. So if you guys sign up to an in-person course, I will throw in our entire Kids Back to Sport online course if you sign up tonight for one of those 2 dates. And equally, you can use that code at any point on the playback if you're watching a recorded version of this. Please do get behind the Kids Back to Sport project. There's loads of resources there for you. There's handouts on everything from growth and maturation through to Osgood's, Severs. You can send those to your patients. Why do kids get injured? And we want to make this a resource centre that is available for all therapists, teachers and coaches, so that there's credible places that they can send their athletes to get information. Please do follow me on social media. And if there are any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was amazing. So much information in, you know, such a compact time, but so comprehensive, which I think as different clinicians we can all relate to in different ways, but is so important to all of us, you know, as a whole. So we have got a couple of questions. If anyone else has got any others, feel free to pop them in while we're just going through these first two. But I think you probably answered most people's questions as you're going through, because I know you did with mine anyway. So we'll start off with neurodivergent individuals. Will these techniques still meet their needs in terms of how they respond to the rehab, or is there pre-work needed first? These studies seem to be focused on neurotypical groups.
We're not sure whether these studies are on neurotypical groups is the answer, because what we're observing in a lot of the guys that do get the recurrent injuries is that they have got slower reaction times pre-injury. So the important part here is in those studies that we're looking at the impact tests is what was causing them to have reduced reaction time, what was causing a reduction in processing. So yes, some of these guys may go on to get a concussion, but what's the link to the ACL, and is that where we've started to go? So I guess part of the studies are now beginning to explore the why. But I think the other part to it, and it's a great question, is the reason why I've got the synaptic goggles is I'm looking at how many of our kids who have got neurodiversity will tolerate the glasses. Some do, some don't. Some love them. They think they're really quirky. And yet others are absolutely freaked out. So because autism particularly is such a big spectrum, some children have hypersensitivity to light, hypersensitivity to other things, and yet in others, they're not hypersensitive to light. So some tolerate it. What I have noticed is those that get travel sick and have an underlying perhaps vestibular issue, they feel sick immediately. So what we are just looking at is how do these glasses fit with kids? How do they fit with different population types? And it's a great question, Sarah. And hopefully over the next year, I'll be able to feed back more as I get more and more kids in these glasses and seeing what happens. But there's other work going on around the world as well.
No, definitely. Thank you. And I suppose off the back of that, my natural question would be, do you think it would, I mean, bigger research, but do you think it would work the opposite way, where you could maybe highlight some of the possible diagnosis of neurodivergence from doing these tests?
So certainly, I would say that you will highlight the children, say, for example, that I ask them to multitask. It will often become apparent during those early phases of rehab which kids have more processing issues than others. but they may have, like my children had auditory processing issues, but their visual processing was exceptional. So if they were showed something, they learned it immediately. But if they were told something, so because it's so individual, I think it does become quite obvious quite quickly. I think we need to be careful that we don't overload young athletes, particularly those that are neurodiverse. And also consider the environment that they're in. I've done a brilliant online course around this, whereby looking at creating treatment environments that are conducive to neurodiverse populations, both adults and children, and choosing times of day where perhaps they are able to focus. So whilst I'm causing chaos, I don't want the kid to be actually distracted in a busy gym. So I'll quite often, with my neurodiverse populations, sometimes bring them in at the weekends so that there's nobody around, so that I can actually get some work done with them without them just basically being all over the place.
That's fantastic. No, that is really, really good. Thank you. So another question here, we'll go for Phil's question. Is there any evidence on how fatigue may affect cognitive demands and response, which is kind of, I suppose, links into what you've just said, really?
I think there is, Phil, there's loads of papers around the impact of sleep on concentration, memory, and it's a really good point. When you look at any of the work I do around why kids get injured and how can we, instead of just getting them to do less, boost their capacity to do more, my belief is that injuries occur predominantly when maybe their battery is lower, and it's not all about the spike in activity. If you took a class of 30 12-year-olds, they'll all be doing the same sport, but they don't all get injured on the same day. And what is it that's changed in that child? Is it that they're stressed that day? Is it that they've not slept as well? They've got hay fever at this time of year? What is it that's changed? And it's, for me, that's the bit that probably flips them into injury at that specific point. So I think that's something that we really need to look. But also, I'm not sure whether Phil's take on that is around fatigue testing. So I'll send all my kids out to run for as long as they are going to run on a sports field in my return to play. And then they've got to come in and pass the cognitive testing with multi-directional hopping and dual tasking as well. So I'm not sure whether his bias to that question was around fatigue and return to play, or fatigue, just the kids not getting enough sleep, or adult.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Again, thank you. Really, really interesting. Are there any others, just with these last few minutes, that you're particularly interested in answering, if you can see them there?
I can see them. So I think Kai has asked a really good question. Would the level of maturation and structural function plasticity change the approach to the activity used? Is that children invariably, if we take an average, bear in mind that maturation, say, of a standard 11-year-old could be as much as 3 years behind and 3 years ahead. So an 11-year-old could have the maturation of an 8-year-old up to a 14-year-old. So this is where the kids' literature becomes a real issue. But you can't generally multitask until you get a maturation age of around 8, somewhere around. So we're not going to be able to do this in that younger population. But then I would say that I can cause plenty of chaos in the sub-8 population without having to multitask. But yeah, it's a great question. And I do think we need to be aware of that, is that we need to make sure that these kids don't get, particularly the perfectionists, a lot of sporty kids really fundamentally don't like to feel stupid. We didn't like to feel stupid when we learned to drive. Kids don't like to feel stupid in the treatment environment. So we've got to pitch this to the right level so that they get that enhanced expectancy. They get that feeling of success. They feel good about themselves and they want to try it again. I'll often use the term "you've got it," just to actually reinforce to them that I believe they can do it. And a really quick one, Abigail, are there any clues to look for when dealing with clients in order to tell if they prefer positive or negative? 1-word answer or 2 words? Ask them. Ask them what they want. That's part of the choice. So yeah, that's basically a really, really important one. Any others you can spot? I think we're pretty much on the button there.
Yes, well, we'll finish there, but thank you so much, and honestly, great answers as well. Again, so interesting, such a topic, like you say, that you could speak about all of those things for 40 minutes and more in total, I'm sure. So thank you again from myself. And obviously thank you everyone for coming. We will just pass over to Andrew to finish off for us today.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, everyone. Some brilliant comments there, Angie. So hopefully you've picked up on some of that as people have been ending. I think, like always, it shows the importance of sort of a multidisciplinary team. And we've had presentations from optometrists before, and obviously there's links between what you're talking about in terms of the vestibular system and things tonight. So it's all interlinked, and also interesting, we've heard it before, the role of the therapist or practitioner as a coach, I think came out a lot from your presentation. So it's about how you get the best from people, isn't it, really?
Definitely.
And so no, it was really interesting. Thank you ever so much, and thanks everyone as always.
Good. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Everybody's welcome to send me an email if they've got questions that I didn't answer at info@kidsbacktosport.com.
Yeah, please do take Angie up on her offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much again. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their evening, and we'll be back soon in June.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.